I'm Susan Wyche, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information at Michigan State University. Today, I will be sharing my paper about my use of design workbooks with speculative design proposals in information and communication for technology, or ICTD, research. This paper is part of a larger 5-year study that broadly focuses on understanding technology use and design in rural Kenyan households. This particular paper contributes a case study based on my experience using the design workbook method in research conducted in Bungoma, Kenya. I use the workbook and the images in it as prompts in interviews with 22 participants. This paper also contributes a design workbook with 12 novel speculative design proposals in it. These ideas offer an alternative to the more traditional ones pursued in ICTD. What are design workbooks? Bill Gaver introduced them to the HCI community more than a decade ago. He described them as both a method for design and as a design methodology. Practically speaking, they are a collection of speculative design proposals that support conversation between designers and between designers and the people they're designing for. And when I say speculative, I mean a critically oriented research practice that creates artifacts or representations of possible and alternate design futures. Strictly speaking, the concepts in my workbook are not meant to be implemented or commercially viable. Instead, they're meant to raise questions about the values and politics embedded in design through design. So what did I do in my study? And again, I want to remind you that this is part of a 5-year project investigating technology use and design in rural Kenyan households. When I talk about my design process and my research, it's important for me to briefly note my positionality or my stance as a designer. I'm obviously white. When I'm in Kenya, I'm generally referred to as an Mzungu. I'm also trained as an industrial designer and as a social scientist, and I've been conducting fieldwork in Kenya for nearly a decade. And this is Bungoma, Kenya, the site where the study that I'm talking about today was conducted and where I've conducted most of my research for the last decade. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the proposals in my workbook here. The first is this plastic chair that monitors how long people sit on it and then calculate the cost. This was inspired by the ways that these plastic chairs are used as a livelihood strategy among some of Bungoma's residents. The second idea is a system that lets people monitor and track the chickens they own. This image you see here is a library, and it's sponsored by Google. And it's inspired by thinking of different ways that technology companies can support internet access in places like Bungoma, other than just working towards increasing internet access. The last idea that I will talk about is a system called Mtafiti Opticon. This is a system that lets research participants monitor researchers' behaviors. So after a research project, a participant can rate a researcher on, for example, how well they were treated or compensated, and then send this information to a university's institutional review board. So what did I do with these ideas? I visited 22 households in Bungoma, and I used the workbook images as prompts in interviews. It was a process similar to photo elicitation, and I elaborate on this in the paper. We asked participants to tell us what they think about the ideas, emphasizing that there were no right or wrong answers. We had interview transcripts translated and transcribed. I also took extensive field notes, and the goals of my analysis included understanding how the design workbook method worked or did not work. So what did I find? The use of the design workbook method seemed successful. Using the images as prompts supported a dynamic that differed from the ones I was accustomed to in traditional interviews. Participants led the interviews and asked me questions rather than the other way around. The concept spurred lengthy discussions about the social and historical context in which the concepts could be adopted. Participants' reactions to the ideas in my design workbook also drew attention to the practical problems that might accompany their introduction into their communities. Using the workbook also drew attention to the benefits of asking participants to talk about multiple ideas. Remember, there were 12 ideas in this workbook, and this was a useful way to understand what issues were really important to people and which ones were less important to them. So for the sake of time, I'm going to elaborate on one of these findings, and that's the critical feedback that I received from participants. So a significant benefit of using the workbooks in my study was that they elicited critical feedback about the ideas. The responses included disapproving comments about them. Participants told me that they disagreed with the ideas and some of them were not good. Participants also laughed at my design concepts, and this is a response I interpreted as them thinking the ideas were absurd or nonsensical, or that they would be out of place in their communities. The concept that you see here that shows this Range Rover traveling on a road made out of discarded mobile phones elicited the most critical feedback and laughter. And although some of the participants appreciated the idea and told me that there were environmental benefits that would accompany recycling old phones, the vast majority were skeptical of this concept. And I'll let you read the quote here, and it was very typical of many that I received from participants when they looked at this idea. So this finding is significant. Prior research in ICTD suggests that it can be difficult to elicit negative feedback. Researchers who've studied this topic talk about a reluctance among participants to offer critical feedback to foreigners like myself. But this wasn't the case when I used the workbook method. Participants were openly critical of my ideas, they laughed at them, and openly questioned their feasibility. So here I return to my initial argument, and that is that using design workbooks can benefit design research in ICTD. How? There are multiple ways that design workbooks can benefit design-oriented research in the field of ICTD, and I elaborate on this in the paper. Here, I'm going to talk about why the community should embrace different outcomes in the design process, specifically outcome alternatives to the familiar design guidelines or testable prototypes. There's a sense within ICTD that for a system to be successful, it must be scalable or commercially viable. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these systems lead to significant flows of hard currency away from countries in the global south and ultimately strengthen these countries' dependency on external actors, for example, in the United States. Yet this raises questions about whether or not these systems really address inequities or just deep. So the discussions of the workbook and the workbook images prompted between myself and participants are also another significant outcome of this research. These discussions are necessary for understanding the potential for technology to, rather than solve problems, lead to new ones. And it's difficult to have these discussions if you only engage with people in their communities one time, as is typical in most ICTD studies. The case study presented here emerged from nearly a decade of intermittent engagement with Bungoma, Kenya. Nearly every participant in this study had participated in at least 3 interviews. They recognized that I was more than just a one-time visitor and that we could engage in this mutual curiosity about each other and learn from each other during interviews. And I want the community to recognize that this mutual learning or developing these sustainable relationships with communities can be as important, if not more important, than working towards developing scalable and sustainable technologies. This concludes my talk. Thank you for listening. I want to thank my collaborators in Kenya, Nightingale Simiyu and Willis Okumu. This research has been funded by a career award from the National Science Foundation. Thank you, or for the Swahili speakers, asante. Please read the paper for more information.